In this video, we'll start our discussion about developing web applications using the ASP.NET Core framework. But before we do that, let's first review some background. In classes like CS3220, we have learned how the web works. Basically, when we enter a URL in a browser, either by entering the URL directly in the address bar or by clicking on a link, we are basically telling the browser three things. First, we tell the browser that we want to see a particular page, and the page is this path component in the URL. We also tell the browser on which server the page is hosted, and this is the host component in the URL. And we also tell the browser that it should communicate with the server using the HTTP protocol, which is a protocol component of the URL. After getting this URL, the browser will send a HTTP request to the server, telling the server that it wants that particular page. The server then locates that page on the disk and sends it back in an HTTP response. After getting the page in the response, the browser displays it and we see the page. All in all, it's pretty straightforward. The only thing is that this page has to be pre-created and stored on the server as a file. This is why we call this the static web, meaning that we are getting something that's pre-created and doesn't change. Static web pages sometimes are not enough for certain situations. For example, when we search something on Google, Google needs to return a page showing the search results. But because Google cannot predict what people will search, they cannot pre-create the result pages. In other words, the result page has to be dynamically generated based on the user's request. At the conceptual level, this is actually not too difficult to do. All we need to do is to replace some pre-created files with a program. These programs will take HTTP requests as input and generates HTTP responses as output. And this program is basically what we call a web application. And the server that's capable of running such applications is called an application server or simply a web server. There are many languages, frameworks, and platforms we can use to develop web applications. For example, we use C# in this class, and in CS3220 we use Java. You probably also used or heard of PHP, JavaScript, Python, Ruby, and so on. Regardless of what language or what framework we use, there's a good chance that it will be developing the web applications using the Model View Controller architecture, because it is the most popular architecture for web application. Under this architecture, the application is divided into controllers, models, and views. Controllers are responsible for processing requests, and the results are models that are passed from controllers to views. Views are responsible for combining the data in the models to some HTML template text to produce the HTML pages sent back to the client in HTTP responses. In this class, we'll spend most of our time on developing MVC web applications. MVC web applications have been the most popular form of web application for many years. But then people realized that we could get better performance and more flexibility by not doing view on the server. This led to the so-called RESTful web services, more commonly known as REST API or simply Web API. We can think of REST API or Web API as MVC minus the V. So, in other words, Instead of generating HTML pages, the controllers simply return data itself. This obviously makes the server more efficient and more scalable because it no longer needs to generate web pages. And in addition to that, it also gives us a lot more flexibility because now with one backend server, we can support many different kinds of client applications at the same time. Because Web API is basically MVC minus the V, if we know how to do MVC, it's easy to do Web API. And later in the course, we'll see how to do it using ASP.NET Core. Now, let's create an ASP.NET Core web application in Visual Studio. We'll start with create a new project. And then here, we can search web to see what web application templates it provides. And on the top, we can see two ASP.NET Core web apps. It's a bit confusing. Make sure you choose the sorry. So there, yeah. So this one is ASP.NET web application, not an ASP.NET Core web application. And this one is the one that we want, the one that says ASP.NET Core web app parenthesis model view controller, not the one which just says ASP.NET Core web app. This one uses a related but different technology called Razor Pages, but this one is what we want. Now here we enter the name for the project, and for the solution it's the same deal as before when we do C# console applications. So I'll leave the name as the default web app1. And for framework, we of course want the latest .NET Core, which is .NET 5. And for authentication type, we'll leave it to none. Web applications usually do need authentication, and later in the course we'll add authentication to the mix, but we'll leave it out for now. Also, uncheck configure for HTTPS. When we deploy a ASP.NET Core web application for real, it's usually deployed either inside a IIS server or behind a web server like Nginx. So configuring HTTPS here is actually unnecessary. Also, we don't cover container in this course, so leave out Docker. Please do remember to check enable Razor runtime compilation. This basically allows us to add the view pages while the application is running, and we'll be able to see the changes without having to restart the application. This one is very much needed for development. So now let's create the project. Okay, now let's close this and let's run the created project. So this is what the created project looks like. There are a couple of pages, but nothing else. Before we look into the code, let's try a couple of other ways to run the project. So if we expand here, we can see that there are a couple of other ways to run the project. Instead of the IIS Express option, there's another option called Web Application 1, which is the project name. And there's another one called WSL2, and this one you will definitely not need. This one will basically run the application inside the Windows subsystem for Linux, which is something completely unrelated to this course. Anyway, let's try the second way. Before we try, let's try the second way. So this will run the same web application, but notice that it will run as a port 5000. Excuse me. And this one will run as a port of 9508. And there's yet another way to run it. We can simply go to the project folder and do a .NET run, just like running a C# console application. And if we go to the URL localhost 5000, we'll see the web application running here. So what's exactly the difference between these few ways of running the application? Well, it's basically because they use different so-called launch profiles. If we look under the project and under the properties folder, there's a file called launchsettings.json. And this is where the launch profiles are defined. So as we can see here, the IIS Express profile launched the application at port 9508, and this project name profile will launch it at port 5000. Besides the different port numbers, the more important difference between the profiles is that the IIS Express profile runs the application on the IIS Express web server. And by the way, IIS stands for Internet Information Services, which is a Microsoft web server software. IIS Express, as the name suggests, is a slimmed down version of IIS that comes with Visual Studio. The project name profile, which is also used by .NET Run when we run it on command line, does not use the IIS Express web service. Instead, it actually runs the application as a console application using a built-in web server called Kestrel. This is what it looks like when we run the application as a standalone console application. Note that this application literally includes a web server itself, so there's no need to deploy it to a server. This is very convenient, especially during development. If you remember, in CS3220, it's quite a hassle to deploy servlet code to Tomcat on the CS3 server. With ASP.NET Core, the application comes with its own server, so no more extra work for development. Although the Kestrel server is quite capable, in real development, you may want to hide it behind a more widely supported and battle-tested web server. In a Linux environment, is usually the web server engines or Apache, and this is called a reverse proxy setup, where the application plus the Kestrel built-in server sits behind another web server. If you are going to deploy your application on a Windows server, the recommended setup is to use an IIS server to run the application directly without using the built-in Kestrel server. And this is called the IIS in-process hosting model. There's one more so-called hosting mode, basically using IIS in a reverse proxy setup. This setup is not really recommended for anything because if you already have an IIS server, you are much better off using the in-process mode to run the application directly. But if you want, you can do something like this, and it's called IIS out-of-process hosting mode. Okay, moving on from how to run the application, now let's look at the application itself. As we can see here, the project template creates a number of folders. The www root folder is for static resources like images, style sheets, HTML, and JavaScript files. The controllers, models, and views folder are for, as you can guess, controllers, models, and views. As you develop the application, you'll add more files. You can create additional folders for C# code and other files, but the views should only be in the views folder. The project template also creates two important classes, program and startup. The program class has a main method that runs the application using the built-in Kestrel server. If you want to configure the Kestrel server, this is the place to do it. We'll mostly just leave it as is though. There's nothing here that we have to change. The startup class has two methods, configure and configure services. Configure configures the middleware in the middleware pipeline, and configure services registers services for dependency injection. Both middleware and dependency injection need a bit explanation. We'll skip them for now to keep this video short. We'll discuss them in more details in the next video. The more important thing in this video is to have a general understanding of how a request is processed in an ASP.NET Core MVC application. So let's use the privacy page as an example. Let's run this and look at this page. Now, the first thing to notice is the path component of the request. It has two segments, home and privacy. The first segment is used to locate a controller class, and because it's called home here, it will look for a class called home controller. Notice the naming convention here is controller name plus the word controller, and the first segment of the path matches the controller name. So, in other words, this request will be processed by the controller class home controller. Now, inside the controller, the second segment of the path component, privacy here, will be used to locate a method that handles this request. And if we look inside this controller class, we can see the method called privacy, which matches the second segment of the path. And this is a method that will be used to process this request. After this method processes the request, it will forward the request to a view, as in the MVC architecture. Here we can see that it returns a view, but it doesn't say the name of the view. By default, it means that the view will have the same name as the method name. So in other words, we'll be looking for a view file called privacy. And this file should be under a folder that matches the name of the controller, and all the views should be under the views folder. So from that, we look under views, look under home, which matches the controller name, and look under and look at the view file, which is called privacy, matching the method name. So it's this one. Now, just to verify that this is indeed the one, we can add something here. We can say hello view. And if we go back to this page and refresh, we can see hello view here, meaning that this is indeed the view page that generates the response. The process of mapping a request to a method that handles the request is usually called routing, and the process of locating the view file to generate the response is usually called view resolution, meaning resolve a view name to a particular view file. Here's another example showing a controller class and an action method. This one also passes a model object to the view. Notice that the model object is passed to view as an argument to the view method. Remember in CS3220, when we use servlet, we usually implement only one or at most two actions per servlet, using the doGet method, the doPost method, or both. Notice that here in ASP.NET Core, we can actually implement as many actions as we want inside one controller class. So now that we know how the home/privacy request is handled, how about this one? Notice that this URL doesn't have a path component, or in other words, the request is sent to the root path of the web application. Well, to see how this request is handled, we just need to look at the routing configuration in Startup. Which is here. I'm including the code here on the slide for easier reading. So this is basically the code. We'll talk more about routing in a later video, but here we can kind of tell how it works. Basically, a request path should have at least two segments. The first segment is used to locate the controller class, and if this segment is missing, the framework will default to the home controller. Similarly, if the second segment is missing, it will default to an action method called index. So, in other words, this request, not having either segment, will default to home controller and the index method. So it will be handled by this method. There's a third segment which is optional. Notice the question mark here. The syntax is like nullable type in C#, basically saying this one could be empty. If this one is present, it will be passed to the action method as a parameter called ID. So once we understand the routing pattern, it's easy to tell how this request is processed. So it will be mapped to the home controller index action method, and the index action method will return a view by default. It's going to be, the view is going to have the same name as the action method, so it's going to be called index, and there's a folder that matches the controller name. So this is the view for this page. Again, to verify, we can add something here. Let's say, we'll say I class. It will show hi class here, meaning that this one is indeed the view that generates this page. One more thing I want to explain in this video is the layout page in Razor View. The view engine used in ASP.NET Core is called Razor. It serves the same purpose as JSP, but personally I like it a lot better than JSP as it's more powerful and easier to use. We'll spend a whole lecture on Razor later. Here, I just want to explain the layout page so we can see the full picture of how a request is processed. Notice that in this index view, there are only a few HTML elements. But if we look at the page inside the browser, we can see there's a lot more. In fact, what's generated by the index view is only a small part of the page. So where does the rest of the page come from? Well, the rest of the page comes from a layout page, which is this file, underscore layout.cs HTML under views/shared. So it's this one. So this layout page contains a bunch of HTML that's shared by all view pages. And the actual content for a particular view is inserted into this layout by this render body method call. And notice that this method call is inside a div called a div with class container and inside a main element, and that's exactly this one. Now, let's add a little bit here just to see how the layout page works. So if we say add this is from layout here, and if we refresh, we get this is from layout, and if we go to a different page, we get the same thing because all these pages share the same layout page. Okay, so this is basically it for this video. Please read the first two chapters uh, of the ASP.NET Core in Action second edition book. And also in the rest of the class, we'll be using the UI library Bootstrap to style the web pages. Bootstrap is covered in CS3220, so you should already know it. If you need to learn it or review it, here are the links to the Bootstrap official site, a lecture video, and some lecture notes. Thanks, and see you in the next video.